Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CircleID events in partnership with the Edgemoor Research Institute. Today is part two, Filling the Gaps, Beyond Whois. And we are here to continue the conversation that we started 2 weeks ago regarding what kind of solutions may be available to solve issues regarding registration data access for domain names. We have an esteemed panel, and I will introduce them as they're on deck, and they are welcome to introduce themselves. Many are well known to the community, and some may be new to this particular community. But we're all here to talk about sort of the elephant in the room, being after 20 plus years, are we closer to getting the type of access that we feel is necessary to conduct business online, understanding that regulatory requirements around the world have changed in terms of privacy, understanding that there's exponentially more domain names. There are going to be more domain names after ICANN's new rounds. And what does that mean? What does that mean for everybody on the different sides of these transactions, whether those who collect data, those who process data, those who require data to do their daily business, particularly in areas of enforcement and research and cybersecurity, and of course, just everyday transactions, buying and selling domain names. So there's a lot to think about here on this subject. And I do want to address one point that was raised at the very end of the last session. And I think it's a good idea to start off with this session with a little bit of an editorial response. So it has been brought to the attention of the Edgemoor team, the Project Jake team, that there is a real concern that these talks and discussions are happening outside of ICANN's multi-stakeholder model, and given ICANN's role in domain name administration, assignment, policy, that it seems a little maybe misaligned, and perhaps all of this should be inside of ICANN. And I want to make very clear that what Project Jake aims to do is provide a technical solution that would comply with real-world law and that could, in fact, solve a problem that ICANN has been exploring now since its existence. There is never, or at least to my understanding and why I am involved, is that there is never been an intention to subvert the multi-stakeholder model as much as to provide a technical solution that certainly be considered under the multi-stakeholder model. That's one option. Or, in fact, perhaps it could be offered as a standalone private solution that could be voluntarily adapted by those who control information and might find this a technologically acceptable way to comply with the myriad laws you are faced with complying. Nobody is unaware of the risks of noncompliance. Everybody is aware of the importance of the protection of personal data. And where, at least on my side, the IP owner's side of the equation is, we also recognize that there is a need at times for enforcement and for enforcement information. And how do we get that information in a legal way, in a way that complies with law, in a way that we can reassure those from whom we get the data that we won't be misusing data and that we won't be creating a problem ourselves. So I think it's important to lay that groundwork out, because I do think it's a misperception that somehow we're trying to make an end run around policy discussion. And that certainly has never been the intent. And so with that, I want to get started, and I want to welcome everybody because there is a lot to cover. And we're going to start out with a discussion among our data holders. We feel we spent a lot of time on the last session talking about those who use data, but now it's very important to think about those who hold data, control data, process data. And with that, I'm going to get started with the discussion of what does good look like. In a world post GDPR, in a world post ICANN's RDRS system, in a world where we're operating now, what does good look like for you? And I'll start with Sarah Wyld from Tucows.
Thank you. Hi, this is Sarah. Trust everybody can hear me, and I hope everybody's doing well today. Oh no, I just closed my notes. That is the opposite of what I'd intended to do. Okay, just give me 1 second to reopen that. Um, so to start with, in case some of you don't know me, hello, I'm Sarah. I think I just said this because it's automatic. I work at Tucows. I live in Toronto, Canada. I am the head of policy and privacy at Tucows, and also happy to serve the registrar stakeholder group as the vice chair for policy. While we're working on putting my slide up on the screen, I will say I really appreciate Lori's intro that we just heard discussing how this work fits into the policy work that's happening at ICANN. That had been a concern for me. So I'm really pleased to hear that consideration of how this conversation fits together with the ICANN process. Okay, so thinking about what does good look like, here's my slide, thank you so much. First up, characteristics of good requests. A good request provides all the information needed for the evaluation. Requests are honest and correct about who the requester is and why they need the data. Good requesters respond promptly if the registrar has requests for more information. Those are good requests. Tell us everything you need. Give us everything we need. Both of those, right? Tell us what you need. Tell us what we need to know. Okay. There had been, and I don't know, maybe it was on the last call, some thoughts about like what is motivating registrars in their evaluations. And I would say really it's the data custodian's obligation to adhere to whatever local laws there are, whether those are data protection laws, other related laws. And there's potential for harm to the data subject, as well as fines and loss of ability to do business if they violate those laws. So the data custodian needs to balance those obligations and concerns against the requester's legitimate interest in the data and whatever process they're trying to complete that needs the data as part of what they're looking at. So I'm not aware of any registrar that really considers their own reputation as likely to disclose or likely to deny when they're making a disclosure decision. But I do imagine that some might consider potential for getting a reputation as a data holder that does not adequately protect data as part of their motivation. So that's a thing to think about.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that's a good segue. I would say, I'm just going to intervene very quickly. I think one of the things on the requestor side there may be some confusion about what all is necessary. And I think, and I think that would be a question to really follow up with and perhaps form more conversation around is there seems to be some confusion about what may or may not be necessary per request.
Sure. So that's sort of the right side of my slide. And so I would say the requests are likely to be approved when the requester demonstrates that they do have a valid legal basis to access the data for each relevant domain name. Or if it's a domain using our privacy service, they need to provide due process. And requests are more likely to be denied when they're just a purchase offer or an attempt to contact the domain owner. Those things can be done through the public whois without any further disclosure of data. Or requests are likely to be denied when they do not demonstrate that valid legal basis. So I sort of think that the hope in this conversation was that I would say, if you can provide A, B, and C, then you will get X, Y, and Z. And we can't really say that because each case is different. And that's why we need that meaningful human review. At Tucows, we have a lawyer look at every single disclosure request to evaluate it. So what we can say is what information is required when submitting a request. And that has been determined through ICANN policy. Also, the registrar stakeholder group has provided a document of I think it's 7 questions that should be included in every disclosure request. And then also, we could share some examples of real requests that have been processed and what their outcomes were. Those, I'm sure, are familiar to everybody here because they were shared back at ICANN 80 in one of our sessions. And I'm just realizing now, if I leave notes in the chat, I don't know if everybody can see it. But the slides will be shared later, and you can click through to that link on the slide. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Right now, my understanding is the chat may be limited to the panelists. However, we have a Q&A box, and anybody who has a question can certainly raise it in the Q&A box. And we do have a question from Karen Day. And I believe, Sarah, you might have answered it because now I'm showing it as no open question. Sharing of the link. Yes. So what we can do, yeah, Shara has shared the link in the Q&A box. So that is your audience means of contacting this group and getting your answers. So I'm glad that worked well. That's great. Thank you so much. And from there, Sarah, if we can move on to Jothan now, or are there any final words you'd like to say?
That was everything I wanted to share at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm going to go to Jothan Frakes, also probably well known to most on this call. And Jothan also comes from a registrar, not quite as big as Tucows, but certainly a registrar with lots of work to do and in serving the community. So thank you, Jothan.
Yeah, absolutely. And a privilege to be here. I'm not quite as large as Tucows. I would be a barnacle on the mega yacht that Tucows represents with the scale of my registrar. And I serve a different demographic. So hi, I'm Jothan Frakes. Many know me from co-founding NamesCon, which is one of the larger industry conferences. And I serve now on the nominating committee and the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. But I've been around since before there was an ICANN. And so I've seen the many epics, the many 7-year cycles of the challenges with Whois data between requesters and data holders. And it's nice to see some evolutions happening now. I'm taking a little bit of a different tack because Sarah is such a difficult act to follow. She has founded and formed a communications subgroup within the registrar stakeholder group. And we work painstakingly between ourselves and the registries to create a fantastic library of documents that help people understand our complex industry. I think we as insiders become very familiar with our acronyms, some of the formats, structures, and evolutions of all the policy as it goes. And so I just wanted to pay you that public compliment, Sarah, and use a little bit of my time because I don't have a lot to add to you. My registrar is a very different profile. I sit and when I have a new customer, I sit across from them at a table and I have them show me a government issued ID. This doesn't scale at all. It's my get rich never technique. But I have absolutely no abuse and I have very little challenges with requests for data at my registrar. So it's a nice trade-off. What I lack in business growth, I gain in not experiencing abuse or compliance costs. So it works out very, very well. Where Sarah had explained the support of balancing tests is kind of a direction that I go with respect to what does a good request look like. We are often put in a position, I help out a number of other registrars in addition to my small puny registrar. I'll occasionally get because of the experience I have, I'll have a larger registrar contact me and say, what in the world do I do with this? This is really confusing. I'm stuck between the Scylla and Charybdis. I have, on the one hand, this really challenging issue with respecting, privacy regulation. And on the other hand, I've got this urgent demand for data that I need to fulfill. But I can't necessarily, this comes from, maybe an East Asian law enforcement. It looks legit, but I'm not sure if it's legit, but I have to turn it around in, 48 hours or, some imminent deadline. Meanwhile, if it's about a European data subject, so, which do I do? Do I violate a law? Do I go into potential compliance challenge? Have they given me enough to really make the weight here? Can I determine this is legitimate law enforcement request, for example? We find ourselves often in these difficult situations that we have to make rather rapidly inside of some of our registrars. And these types of very complex, challenging reviews based upon larger volume registrars sometimes have to get looked at by escalation inside of our organizations. So they're not inexpensive to do, but we really, because of the potential consequences financially or even civic consequences on the one hand, or the compliance costs that might result from it, we can't just place those in our tier 1 support. They're things that we have to look at with an incredibly careful eye. And so, we are looking for quite a lot of things of substance in the request. Is the basis of the request something that would allow us to respond? In some cases, in some jurisdictions, we have to think about that and place great care on, disclosing potentially, private information. With law enforcement, it's different. I mean, it's obviously you've got subpoenas, you've got, more of a legitimacy, but then it gets into softer areas. We have seen a variety of different edge cases, for example, where, some new marketing person inside of one arm of a corporation might register a domain name unbeknownst to the rest of the corporation's policy about domain registrations, and then have the enforcement arm of that same corporation seek information about that domain under privacy, and decide that once it sees that it is in fact the same company, it doesn't want to sue itself. We see things like that happen all the time because of the redaction and privacy being present in domains. The other thing that really drives towards privacy, and this is, I think, the crux of the request area, is piercing privacy. I think that's really fundamentally a lot of what we're looking at here. That we want to make sure that the registrant doesn't get harassed with marketing and types of nuisance communications, or worse. In many cases, spam or phishing might be enabled by the better intel that you can get on a registrant when you contact them at the compelled communication channels. We talk softly about being able to offer somebody money on a domain name or attempt to buy the domain name, but sometimes the contact is more nefarious or problematic. And then there's legitimate things like law enforcement needing to notify a potential victim, needing to contact potential just to review a potential case. You've got law enforcement issues, but also trademark enforcement. If you've got somebody who's clearly infringing on a brand, it may be the case that the corporate attorney or representation for that corporate brand needs to get in touch with the party who's the registrant of the domain name to have a discussion about it, and to make sure it's not another arm of the company, candidly, which does happen more times than we'd like to admit. So looking at what a good request versus a bad request, we really just have a lot to balance. And I would say, the more substance you can put into it, we don't really need to know a lot about, don't include a 65-page PDF of how robust your trademark is. That's noise. It doesn't help us. In fact, it makes it harder for us to wade through. We just want to hear about the basis of the request. So there's this tool called RDRS, and there's another called Tucows that are, kind of requester-based, which we really want to look at, because they help draw out a lot of the important components that we need to look at as far as the request and responding. It's not a perfect system. They're using it to measure, what types of requests they get. But ultimately, it helps to kind of tease out some of the data elements that help us to determine what a good request looks like, so that we have what we need in order to respond and do the balancing tests we have to do on the back end. I covered a little bit of ground there, but again, I'm having to ad-lib a little bit because Sarah did just such a tremendous job. And I don't know if there'll be some questions. I'll check the question and answer pod after this. But I did want to leave some time because I'm followed, I think Federico Neves is after me, and I want to leave time for him because he's a registry and he also comes at it with a little bit of an international flavor.
So thank you, Jothan. Yeah,
thank you.
thank you so much. I think you've added a lot of context to Sarah's slide, and the two of you are actually a fabulous team. So I think we worked that out pretty well. And yes, Federico, we'd love to hear your perspective, and particularly since you're outside of the US and you're a registry and you come from a different world with different types of operations.
Thank you, Lottie. Thank you, Jothan and Sarah. And so I'm Federico Neves. I work for the Brazilian registry. And so I think I have a much narrow perspective from this regarding what good looks like for requests. So because I would like to give a little background. In our case, the registry is a quite closed registry, so we are not open for the world at large, and there is no other jurisdiction than the Brazilian law. And so in that case, what I would like to point out is that in the registry, in our case, we have a very strict way to distinguish between persons, I mean, natural and legal ones. So it's quite easier to deal with the situation when perhaps like 40% of the registry is objects owned by legal institutions. So in that case, basically, there is no restrictions regarding the Brazilian law, and what we provide in the directory services is basically almost all that we have. For the natural persons, obviously we do have some restrictions on the directory service, and in the time when we receive requests for extra information, like perhaps postal addresses and payment informations and others, we only accept requests for those informations from basically from the law enforcement or subpoenas / court orders. And in those cases, it's obviously that this will be dealt by our legal team, and obviously we will comply with this information. And besides of that, the historic data, if any, is present. So it's a quite more, as I said, narrow view, because we don't have the majority of the challenges that I see in the G space, basically because in the G space, I guess it's not quite easy to distinguish among the owners of the domain names. And even it's not quite easy to have strong unique identifiers in the registry, or even in the registrar databases to distinguish and take this as a way to moderate, a way to decide how we will deal with a request. So quite differently from what we see with the reductions in the G space. In our case, we have almost no reductions besides reductions on public unique identifiers for natural persons. Public unique identifiers for legal persons, it's completely disclosed in the directory service. And basically that's what I would like to comment and point out as the differences and the challenges that we still have, but not as near as the big ones that you guys see on the Gs, because of the the legislation regarding the privacy that we have been seeing the last few years.
Thank you, Federico. I think that's a very good perspective, something we don't hear all the time. So we very much appreciate your contribution. We do have some time allocated now for Q&A. Members of the audience, you're welcome to type your Q&A in. If there's anyone on the panel who has a Q for your co-panelists, you'd be welcome to raise your hand. And I'm going to take a little bit of prerogative here and make a comment that may or may elicit some response from our three speakers. I hope it does. And that is this. When we talk about good, what does good look like? I see from the point of view of the registrar that good looks like a complete, legally based, thorough request that also creates some guarantees that the data that is received will not be used for any other purpose than for what it was intended to be used for. That's what I hear, that's what I understand, and that's certainly what I would expect if I were a registrar. But I look at that question also a little more holistically, not just on a request by request basis, but it appears to me anyway, in terms of the what's the word I want to say, the indefinite nature or the unpredictable nature of when or when not a data protection authority might actually challenge a registrar's policies or challenge the way data has been disclosed, opening up the registrar to an enormous amount of financial risk. And in my view, the risk that's being asked of the community, quite frankly, is very high. And I'm not sure that it's proportionate to the harm, but that's another debate at another time. But I would imagine what good would look like too on a holistic basis is, do we have a system that we can efficiently use that has parameters in it, that if those parameters were met and information were to be disclosed, that it could be easily defended were it to be challenged by a DPA or a lawsuit, God forbid, or some other means of enforcement that would put the registrar itself at risk. Now, we know that a lot of laws, and Sarah's made the very good point that having a lawyer look at every request is, in terms of making sure you're mitigating your risk, very efficient in that regard. However, if we were to come up with a system that could handle a higher volume of requests with more certainty, where more answers were evolved, that if we could do this in a way where there's human oversight, but at the same time have an automated solution that makes things smooth, easy, and possibly even sustainable in terms of monetary sustainability, understanding that laws are emerging that and contracts at ICANN do not allow for registrars to charge for information, right? You registrars, you're up a terrible hill, the way I see it. Right? You're being asked to evaluate applications, create forms, have lawyers. That's very, very expensive. At the same time, you can't charge for this. And we're in this vicious cycle of compliance without necessarily sustainability or any sort of automated solution that could really take the burden of hands on every file. So that's what I might look at as a good outcome in a meta sense. And I'm curious if anybody has a reaction to that question who's previously spoken.
I would like to respond.
Sure.
Thank you. So, yeah, I understand where you're going with that. A solution that would make it easier. Maybe a request comes in and then something evaluates it and just suggests what the outcome should be to a lawyer who then looks at it. That is appealing in terms of speeding up a workflow. It introduces risks, as you have stated. So the risk that perhaps somebody will just do what this system suggests, and that's the wrong decision, and then who's responsible? The person that does the thing that was suggested is responsible. So there's a liability concern. Also, like such a system does not exist. I don't know who's going to develop it. But thinking about the sustainability that you mentioned, not only is there a financial sustainability, we also must, of course, consider an environmental sustainability with any type of automation. Generative AI has significant climate impacts, and that would have to be considered in a system like that. We would also need to consider human rights and privacy impacts. So an individual has uncertain privacy laws, has a right not to be subject to automated decision making. If this is a situation where they could argue that the lawyer didn't really consider it and just click the button to do what the automated system suggested, that could have an impact on that person's human rights, could be, again, a difficult legal situation. So for a variety of reasons, it just doesn't seem that that's going to be functional and likely anytime soon. And instead, what seems to make the most sense is to have a system that can automate some aspect of the data intake process and then not automate the part that does require that meaningful human review and oversight. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Do we have any other questions? I don't see any in the pod right now. And I don't see any from the audience, from our panelists, so I'm going to move on. Oh,
You do have a hand up by Gabe.
Gabe, yes, please answer. I didn't see your hand.
Oh, it's all right. I just wanted to share a thought. I think it's a very interesting conversation that I've just been listening to with regards to automation. And I note that just as Sarah very helpfully noted that automation might help with the submission of requests and all the work that goes in left of that request being submitted. It occurs to me, though, that there's potentially opportunity to also employ automation right of the decision, by which I mean many of the considerations that a registrar, and Sarah, I invite you to chime in response to this too, but many of the considerations that you might make might not be themselves unique. I know that every situation in its entirety is a unique situation, but nonetheless, if you're dealing with a requester over and over again, you gain familiarity with how they operate. You might already have made decisions about to what degree that you trust that particular requester, et cetera. And it occurs to me that some of those decisions that you make are nonetheless automatable from there. If you've already decided that anytime that requester A communicates from account B using IP address C, et cetera, that you're comfortable with that risk, at least insofar as authenticating who they are, well, then it's an automatable opportunity to nonetheless implement that decision. And I think that there's perhaps interesting room to explore those situations. Just throwing that out for thought.
Thank you, Gabe. I appreciate that. Next, we have Brian Beckham.
Yeah, hi everyone. Brian Beckham here from WIPO. And just to kind of build on Lori and Gabe's suggestion, two observations. One is we have some experience, which I think maybe bears some parallels to the questions being confronted in terms of compliance with certain criteria, right? So we manage the UDRP. And what we see in the UDRP cases is that roughly 95% of the brand owners who submit a complaint under the UDRP succeed in their complaint. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, of course, we've been doing this for 25 years, so there's a lot of experience. So over the years, people have learned what they need to show to be successful. And of course, that comes, if we kind of go back to the starting point, from the fact that the criteria that the brand owner, so if they're in the kind of the shoes of the requester in the context we're talking about, it's fairly well spelled out for you in black and white. Here's the half a dozen things that you need to prove to have a reasonable chance of succeeding in your case. And of course, people look at those and sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes there's disagreements on some of the finer points of the law. But on the whole, having the criteria spelled out and having some track record to look back in the rearview mirror has helped to really settle the kind of success rate, if you will, if we're talking about the kind of requester context. So I think the reason I mentioned that is really kind of by way of agreement with Lori and Gabe, is that on both sides of the equation, it strikes me that if the right information is given to people, and I've had a look at the anonymized examples, then you would expect both on the requester side and on the processing side that there ought to be some kind of consistency and predictability. I don't want to, suggest that can or should be completely automated. I completely understand that the need to conduct a legal assessment, but I offer that as kind of a benchmarking exercise, and then. Just to kind of go back to something Lori said at the beginning, because I must confess it's a question I had when first looking at this effort, which I think is fantastic, and kudos to the organizers. I think there's a lot of good intentions all around. The question of kind of this is something which has I think a lot of us are very well versed in ICANN, right? And has the kind of the feel of ICANN type policy work, and yet here we are outside of ICANN. And the way I've kind of thought of it is less of kind of policy creation. This is just a personal view for whatever it's worth, but because the question kind of came up in the beginning, the way I've understood it at least is, and this also goes to the fact that we've been asked institutionally at different points in this conversation around Whois disclosure requests. Could WIPO play a role in, for instance, validating the existence of an IP right by a rights holder so that they get a token, which makes it more efficient for the data holders to not have to basically go to a national IP office and check that this person is who they say they are, holds the right they say they hold. I think the kind of the benefits of that are reasonably obvious. But I've looked at this current effort more in terms of looks more like an operationalizing. I don't want to use the word implementation because I know that has a specific meaning in the ICANN context. But for whatever that's worth, I've looked at this kind of conversation very much through that lens. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you. And Jothan, is that an old hand or a new hand?
Well, it's a new hand, but I'll make it a quick hand. I just wanted to say, as Lori kicked off this series of Q&A, identifying, some of the uphill that registrars will have in this, that's a demonstration of the radical empathy that we're really starting to see more and more of in these discussions. And folks will say you're experienced with ICANN. A lot of us have the privilege of knowing each other decades, but we have very specifically calloused hands from the tug of war over this matter. And as we untangle this rope and try to make it more usable, it's good that we are applying that. I have tremendous empathy for law enforcement, for folks in the intellectual property space, for data scientists and researchers who are trying to improve the situation. And I listen with two ears, and I'm going to pause and say I have two ears and one mouth, and I will stop using that mouth because I see Sarah Wyld has her hand up, and I know we're probably up at a time limit here.
Yeah,
but Lori, I wanted to compliment you. Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to compliment you for that empathy, because I think that really is a great way to set the tone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jothan. And I will give the last word to Sarah, and then we'll move on to the next part of our program.
Thank you so much. I'll be real quick. We just heard a statistic from Brian about 95% is what I noted of brand owners succeed. I thought it might be fun to share a sneak peek of our upcoming tiered access taco platform disclosure stats. We have the blog post coming up ahead of the ICANN meeting next week. But so 30, I'm just going to round them, about 30% of requests in our most recent reporting period resulted in disclosure. And about 30% were denied because they did not demonstrate an appropriate legal basis. That's 30 and 30. 20% of requests were incomplete or abandoned. They did not answer our request for an update for more information. And 20% of requests were for domains with our Whois privacy service. So those do require due process. So it was 30 and 30 for disclosed and denied, and then 20 and 20 for incomplete and Whois privacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that's a great note to end on. And we're now going to pass it over to Dr. Steve Crocker, who has been working on a technical solution and who has also quite a lot of experience at ICANN, as we all know. And Steve, please go on to the next part of our discussion.
Well, thank you, Lori. And the slides are being put up here. So just 2 words of introduction on this. As I'm sure maybe most of you know, I sat inside of ICANN in the privileged position of sitting on the board, and for several years as chair of the board, and watched repeated attempts at trying to sort out the Whois problem. And I also had the privilege of having been involved in the internet from the very beginning, basically sort of watched the rise of Whois from the times even before there was an internet, when it was just the ARPANET and before the domain name system. So the equivalent of Whois at the time was who is the sysadmin that's running the time sharing system that's attached to a particular node on the network, for example. And it struck me that the discussions and failed policy attempts involved an awful lot of confusion and a conflation of different issues. And I wanted to see if we could tear those apart and provide a basis for a system that would be better. Now, what constitutes better? 3 criteria, really. One is, without trying to specify what the policy is the system effective in implementing that policy? Another is, how efficient is it all around, not just for the registrars, who are very important in this, but also for the people who are the requesters who are looking up things, and perhaps even from another point of view, from a oversight and governance and enforcement point of view. One doesn't want to have a system in which it's just always a problem for everybody. And the third aspect that I think is important is clarity or certainty. People who use the system, people who operate the system, and people who manage them should, in my view, prefer a system where it's pretty predictable what the results are going to be. That has a big impact on lowering costs and improving effectiveness. But in addition, rather than just rolling it up into those 2 attributes, is also important in terms of credibility and comfort and support for the system. So those are the metrics, if there were a way to measure all of those things, that I think are the kind of thing. And I haven't said a word about what the right answer should be. For example, should it be the case that if somebody wants to make an offer for a domain name, they should be able to find out how to contact that person? Not a question I'm going to answer, but a question that should have an answer by the people who make up the policies for these sorts of things. But with respect to, is this inside or outside of ICANN, multi-stakeholder group and so forth, ICANN has contractual relationships with the registrars and registries in the G space, has a much different kind of arrangement with the CC community, but the same issues apply both within the contracted community and the non-contracted community, if you will, the CCs, and for that matter, with the numbers community as well. The regional internet registries have more or less the same kind of issues. So we've been seeking a kind of a way of thinking about and helping people build systems that work better across the whole spectrum. And there's a number of things that come out from that approach. So let me take you through these slides. There's only a handful of them, and they're at a pretty high level. So one of the first things that one discovers is that there's no way in the world that we're going to have a single policy governing everything. The advantage that is often viewed inside of ICANN is that that's a coordinated development of a policy. Well, yes, except that only applies to the G space. And even in there, it turns out that there's variations of one sort or another. multiple jurisdictions is obviously one source of the variations in policies. Another is that different groups require different policies. The most obvious is the distinction between businesses, so-called legal persons, and humans, so-called natural persons. But there are other subdivisions that are relevant and lead to different orientations to what the policy should be. So in my view, an effective system really needs to accommodate and have space for these different policies. And as I said, with respect to clarity, and it should be clear how each of those pieces fit together, relate to each other, et cetera. Next slide, please. Another fact of life is that policies are hard to develop. They take time. I have a little reference there to Piet Hein, who had a delightful set of books called Grooks, little cartoons and sayings. And one of them was a cartoon that says things take time, and you just have to live with that. Not only do policies take time to evolve, to develop, they also evolve, and so you're not done ever, really. You may have a big push to get an initial policy, and then things are still open. So a point of view is that you're always living in some state of flux. Some things are stable for a long time, other things are not. And that's the way the world is. One has to have a system in which all of that is accommodated, and there's a decent amount of navigation available so that you can know what the state of affairs is. Next slide. Well, a very key thing in any of this is, that comes strongly from my orientation of working with the design and building of systems, but it's also true in many other disciplines as well, is to separate the mechanisms by which you implement this from the specific policies. In simple terms, you can think of it as a machine that has a bunch of settings, and you want the machine to work no matter how you flip those switches. Those switches control the policy, but the underlying machinery of carrying out what it's supposed to do should apply no matter what. Well, what does that mean in the situation we're talking about? Well, a very key part, maybe the most fundamental part, since we're working in the internet space, are common protocols. We now have a 50-year plus history of designing, building, fielding, and using protocols on the internet in order to make the internet actually work. That it's the protocols that bind all of the moving parts together across the entire globe without some central coordination in the operation. And they said, well, certainly there's got to be some central coordination on the protocols. Yes, but that's a consensus process that goes through its own laborious cycle as well, generally in the ITF, although there's other standards bodies involved. But those need to be separated and thought of quite separately from the local administration of policies. So it should, for example, be entirely okay for one set of policies for the EU to have its own set of policies, and for China or the US or other countries to have their own, and for all of those to interoperate in an appropriate way. Not a trivial issue. It may well mean, of course, that you get different answers under different jurisdictions, but that's not the right question. The question is, do you get answers? Can you accommodate the representation of those so that you don't run into a wall where you say, well, we only have room for one policy and it's going to be ours. Next slide, please. Well, here's some strong statements. Building systems on the internet, there is one very long-standing piece of experience, which is you want to avoid centralized operations wherever possible. The reason why the internet works at the scale that it does and has evolved and the way that it has and has affected all of our lives is that there is a heavy emphasis on distributed design. You don't get a situation in which You have to ask permission to be added to the internet. You don't run into a situation in which the only way to route things is through some central routing authority. And equally, in the business that we're talking about here, the design and implementation of policies should not require centralized operation. May require centralized coordination within some particular group as to what the policy should be, but the implementation and operation should be as distributed as possible. There's lots of good reasons for that. Next slide, please. One of the good reasons is that once you have the rules laid out, the implementation can be done by different parties. And so you get, first of all, you don't run into a bottleneck of, well, our team is busy and we can't really get this done. You have as much labor from as many sources as necessary. And that also brings about some competition, which is good in all the usual dimensions. Next slide. So bringing those pieces together, there are multiple policies and multiple policy authorities. So data holders have their individual policies and authorities. By data holders, we're talking about the registrars, of course, and perhaps resellers that may or may not share the same policies as the registry that they're attached to, and registries, of course. But each jurisdiction may and quite often will have different policies regarding what data is collected and who should get access to it and so forth. So there has to be some cooperation among all of these, at least in the sense of knowing which policies apply to a given situation and giving the ability to have these multiple policies that interact. But another aspect of this, and this is a sort of key point, is that there's a huge advantage to groups of data holders, groups of countries, groups of requesters who share common cause or who find themselves comfortable with each other to form groups and aggregate the way they think about things and the way they interact with the rest of the world. And that's a theme that gets repeated over and over again. It's an intermediate point between everybody operates alone on the one extreme, or everybody is forced into a single regime at the other end of the spectrum. So I kind of think of this as a patchwork quilt, but some pieces of that quilt will be very large and some pieces will be very small. And going back to the point I was making about evolution, and whatever the situation is at a given time, it may evolve. And so you may get groups that get larger because more people join them. You may get groups that merge with each other. You may get groups that disappear because they find themselves less useful to be a separate group from somebody else. Next slide, please. One of the elements that is dominant in many of these discussions is the role of identity on the one hand, and the risks that are taken when data is disclosed. And a key point that emerges from such discussions is that identity per se is not quite the right determiner. The real issue is trust, and trust is a many splendid thing. Do I trust your intent, and do I trust your competence to carry out, even if you've said the right things, that you're going to behave properly? So in, let's say, the interaction between a requester and a data holder, the data holder necessarily, either explicitly or perhaps just implicitly, is asking the question, do I trust this requester to do what they, do I trust them that they are the right party to make this kind of request? And do I trust them to carry it out and as I said, trusting not only their intent, but also their capability. And at the end of the day, given that we have a large system with many a wide range of humans involved, not everything works perfectly all the time. And so what do you do when things go wrong? Excuse me just a second. And so is there some sort of accountability, which gets back to what do you know about the people making the request, and what access do you have to know if they've behaved properly and to do something about it if they haven't? And that, I think, would be one of the elements that changes the game tremendously. Next slide, please. So this is a recap of the kinds of questions that we would expect a data holder in general to be concerned with. Is the requester appropriate for the intended purpose? Missing a T there. Can the requester be trusted to use the data for the intended purpose and not for other things? And can the requester be trusted to protect that data? And as I said, is there an adequate process of accountability and enforcement? Next slide, please. So that's the quick tour of the basic concepts. We've done quite a bit of work at thinking about how to design, build, and implement a system that has these attributes. But in order to move in that direction requires a lot more buy-in and energy and a kind of an understanding that it's useful to do that. With that, I'm now open for questions, comments. If you want to throw tomatoes, there's a separate channel for that.
I'll
You're
recognize
on mute,
Sarah.
Mark.
Yeah, I see Sarah has her hand up. And I'm going to look into the Q&A chat box.
Oh, forgot I put the video off. Sorry. Hi, this is Sarah. Yep, Sarah has a lot to say. Okay. I have a few thoughts. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share them. I was making some notes as Steve spoke. I will not try to respond to everything that he shared, but a few things. So one thing that we heard from Steve is that we should have a system that can accommodate a range of policies. I think that is what we have. I think we already have a system where a registrar or registry can implement the legal and business policies that they have or their obligations into a system for determining how they disclose data. That's what we have. One thing you had said is that the question is not whether the requests are happening, but do you get the answers that you should get? Does the requester get the info? And because the implication was that they don't, you should. You should get a response to every single request that is submitted. ICANN policy requires that, right? So if a registrar is not responding to disclosure requests, that can be reported to ICANN compliance. They are required to respond. Some of what I heard was confusing. There was a point about distributing labor, but the data is not distributed. The data is with one particular registrar who is the data controller, or could be a processor depending on their legal setup. But it's very difficult to distribute a decision when the data is not distributed. And then there was a suggestion that there might be an advantage to registrars to banding together and sharing common cause and creating a group to make decisions together. That has not been my experience. Jurisdiction can be different enough to have an effect, even if both businesses are registrars. Internal policy can come into play, even if the jurisdiction is the same. And ultimately, it's very important to keep in mind that we are registration service providers. Calling us data holders really emphasizes the wrong thing. We happen to have data. We do not have data just so we can give it out to third parties. And then finally, to agree with something, because that's always great to do when possible, I do agree that enforceable accountability is important. It is difficult to ensure, and it's something that we think about a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this has basically glided into our stakeholder response. So we're going to move on with that, and I will recognize John McElwaine. Thanks, John. And thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be really brief. I know we don't have a ton of time. So I am John McElwaine. I'm a private practice lawyer, and my involvement with Project Jake is primarily to provide the viewpoint of a requester. And one of the things that excites me about the work that's going on here is that there would be some uniformity. So the issues that requesters see right now are that although, as Sarah mentioned, there is a system that allows for registrars to make decisions, those decisions aren't made uniformly. And so, as you can imagine, with thousands of registrars with applying different policies and different determinations, it almost is a noise that you can't cut through. Now, I'm not to say that there would be a blanket rule that one registrar would have to follow, but by having some communication in place and some best practices in place, I think we can really go a long way to establishing a good back and forth as to what will be accepted or not. And I know that's not a new idea. For instance, the registrars have gotten together and suggested what is a good request and what is not. But what is lacking right now, and it's actually one of the requirements of the SAD model, which is that for there to be some justification of decisions, some explanations, so that there can be that back and forth. We're not necessarily seeing that with the RDRS now, and it doesn't get applied with every decision when you're going outside of that. But again, I think from a requester community side, we are very excited to be working collaboratively on any solution that is going to make it clearer, easier, more efficient for both parties to ask for data and perhaps get it if that request is made legitimately. Thanks.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. And I see Gabe has his hand up.
Hi, yeah, this is Gabriel Andrews. I'm co-chair of the Public Safety Working Group within ICANN. My day job is working for a U.S. law enforcement agency, and so sort of speaking on behalf of my own experiences of having been a law enforcement requester, both through systems like ICANN's RDRS, as well as someone who's written requests for subpoenas or search warrant affidavits and so on and so forth in the past. I note that from the perspective of investigators, and speaking to, I think, some of the dialogue that happened previously on this call about, to what extent does this fall within ICANN conversations and where it doesn't. I think there's, it's very interesting to hear about how a framework could apply that could set expectations about how requests could be formed within ICANN context with GTLDs, for example, perhaps involving an RDRS or a SAD-like system, but also functional beyond the purview of ICANN in spaces like the CCTLDs. Because it's been my anecdotal experience that bad guys don't so much care about whether a domain they're using is a GTLD versus a CCTLD. They tend to care more about, can I get it for free, or can it impersonate the victim I'm trying to impersonate, and those sort of things. And so some benefit from any such framework would be just to help do the busy work of informing how requests can be triaged from law enforcement agencies, whether from country A, B, or C, to the GTLD operators, the CTLD operators, maybe even the RARs if you're talking about IP addresses. Because at the end of the day, you are usually talking about how can we change this internet identifier to some sense of awareness as to who it is that's actually running the show behind it. Are they a bad guy? Are they a commercial service? Are they a victim? And anything that helps us to get those conversations done, to my mind, is something that I think we're happy to collaborate on.
Thank you, Gabe. I think that's noteworthy. And we do have Jim and Rod also teed up for reactions to sort of what's all come before. And I do want to remind the group that we are also now going, once we hear from Jim and Rod, we're going to head into a roundtable discussion that I think should be very lively and could expand a little more on some of these topics. So I'll go ahead and call on Rod, because I see him first, and then we'll go to Jim.
Thanks, Lori. Just got a few comments. I've been involved with Project Jake since I think almost day one with Steve. And I know many of you know me, but part of my background is having run a very large-scale cybersecurity data exchange that was both a private peer-to-peer exchange as well as a public-private exchange between U.S. federal government and various other entities. So some very complex, both system and legal issues, accountability issues, all the things that Steve just outlined. And I'm also involved with the Anti-Phishing Working Group, which does itself a cybersecurity data exchange. So again, very sensitive data being exchanged between entities that don't necessarily know each other, have to create trust mechanisms, et cetera, accountability mechanisms, all of the things that we're talking about, yet on a much larger scale than what we're talking about here, which is the kind of why I found this work fairly ironic. I've been involved in dealing with the Whois stuff for some 20 years or so in various forms. So I find it very refreshing to have been able to help put together kind of building blocks for how to think about these kinds of things, putting the policy not to the side. Policy informs, but this is about enabling various types of policy to be able to interact, and for a very disparate system where you have thousands of players, hundreds on the kind of the registrar side, and 2,000s potentially on the requester side, or more, tens of thousands probably, if you start thinking about all the various folks who've been pulling this kind of data in for years, are trying to. How do you build systems to, or at least the fundamentals for those systems to be able to work, and what are those things you have to think about and make those interoperate? So the good news is this has been done in other places, and to the point where it can be efficiently scaled, where those kinds of decisions, et cetera, are handled through both legal and technical means to make sure that the data is properly shared in the proper manner only to those entities who have the rights and have proven they have that, both the rights and the trustworthiness to receive it and to handle it for their purposes. So it can be done. I'm hoping to see that we can do this in this space as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Rod. And Jim, would you like to have the final word in this little section?
Thank you, Lori. Yes, I am Jim Galvin. I am employed by Identity Digital, one of the larger registry operators, registry service providers in the business. I have been in these discussions for a very long time, had many roles across the ICANN community. And so in that context, I suspect that many of you know me. Nonetheless, I am basically a technologist, and what I want to talk about here today is to leverage a little bit more, peel one layer of the onion away from Steve's presentation about framework and architectural principles. He talked about what does success look like, giving it three characteristics: effective, efficient, and certainty. I believe that over time here, there has been a great deal of talking past each other. I think that we have a lot of people which have a very valid opinion, very valid position, very valid needs. But we haven't taken the opportunity to collaboratively step back and really talk to each other about, what problem are we really trying to solve? When I look underneath the layers of principles that we're talking here, I want to focus on three things: architectural principles, three particular solution spaces, technical solution spaces I think we are looking to solve here. One is authentication and authorization. In Steve's presentation, he talked about enforced accountability. And I want to tease that into two things, one of which is authentication and authorization. I think it's reasonable to understand that everybody needs to know who everybody is. But what exactly does that mean? I mean, this is not to say that there needs to be one universal centralized system for authentication. It also is not intended to mean that every data holder needs to decide, needs to accept all potential authentication systems. So there could be a variety of these things. As Steve was talking about, there should be multiple software solutions, multiple different opportunities here. What we need is standards for how these things interact. so that people can identify themselves in different ways. And then the data holders can make decisions about the quality of that identity. And then they can discuss for themselves in their own positions how they want to authorize those identities and what they want to allow them to do. Okay, so that's what trust is all about, is giving each side the opportunity to make the decisions it needs to. The second thing is about liability, and this gets to the enforcement question. The problem here is this discussion about liability often, falls into the, I'll call it, traditional discussion of indemnification, right? Data holders are obviously very concerned about what happens with data when they release it. And regardless of how you feel about legitimate purpose and legitimate interest, it is reasonable, it should be reasonable to talk about liability being shared. There needs to be some agreement about, if I'm going to give you data, I need some assurance that you are going to handle that data in an appropriate way, that you're not going to do more than you said you were going to do with the data. Okay. And if something happens, you're going to stand behind that. You are going to be responsible for anything that happens with the data once you've got it in your hands. And talking about how we're going to manage all of that is really the discussion that we should be having. Data holders don't want to release data without a great deal of care being applied. And, those who are requesting it really believe that they have a legitimate need and a purpose. But, they're hamstrung, they're being held back by an inability to provide a proper insurance to data holders. Let's talk about that. Let's get through that and figure out what the enforcement mechanism can be in that space. The last thing I want to talk about is automation. Automation, we often end up falling into a discussion of talking about whether a human is involved or not. It is often believed that, especially from the data holder side, that the regulations require that each individual request be evaluated carefully by some kind of human user. I think the important thing to accept here is that the characteristic we're looking for, getting at the efficiency and certainty requirements that Steve was mentioning earlier, is everybody benefits from efficient processing of requests. Let's talk about efficient processing of requests, not about whether it's automated or not. I mean, it's fair to acknowledge that for any data holder at scale, they're going to have to do something on the automation side to be able to respond to high volume. We don't have to know exactly what that's going to look like. There are a variety of ways to do human intervention in a very efficient way without dedicated human resources looking fully at every request. Project Jake aims to get at that. If you look at the tool set that's really being evaluated here and really being developed there, it's about how to efficiently integrate and intersect all of the policies that might come to bear, and then quickly present you as a human, someone who is looking at a request, okay, what the rule set is for that. What does that look like? How do all of those policies apply to this request, and give you something to do that, to look at and decide if you're going to respond. And from a requester side, even as Sarah said in the beginning, there are two principal requirements here, right? Tell me what you need, but tell me what I need. Well, having templates for requests creates efficient processing. And knowing what all of that is going to look like and being able to present things in the right form and in the right way, which gets to this notion of standardized authentication, standardized elements for these things, so that not that it's centralized, but we have a way to look at what everybody is doing and be able to compare them in a direct and semi-automated way, right? So automation should be about efficient processing, not about this fear of not having a human look at it. And everybody should have the opportunity to talk about their needs and how to make all of that work. So very quickly, authentication, liability, automation, I think those are three big topics that all parties can sit down and work collaboratively to talk through, and more so looking for a solution together rather than sitting and defending the position that they believe that they have the right answer all by themselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. I'm looking at the time. We have about a little less than 15 minutes to go. So what I'd like to do is go right into our last section, which is a roundtable discussion where we have representatives from governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and focus on people who've not yet contributed. And we're very honored to have Nigel Hickson from the UK government, Brian Beckham from WIPO, and we have Emanuele, I'm forgetting Emanuele Iovini, also providing an intervention here. And so what I'm going to do is kick it off with Brian Beckham, then Nigel, then Emanuele. And I also have a question that I'd like to pose to the whole group regarding, who enforces against enforcers, which was asked by a panelist. So I'd love to hear the initial reactions first, and then we can hopefully have time to end with that question. So Brian, take it away.
Yeah, hi, Lori. I think I would really echo everything that James said. I think there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of knowledge of positions in this call and in the community. And I just wanted to offer one thing by way of observation in terms of this question of the concern about getting it wrong. And this is something that was actually in the slides from the first version of this talk, but I think it's worth repeating because this is an area where I think everyone recognizes this is in some respects uncharted territory, at least when it comes to the kind of regulatory approach. And fortunately, we do have one governmental agency which has provided a little bit of guidance in terms of the question of how data protection offices will look at the question of a potential mishap in terms of a data request and grant. So the UK Information Commissioner's Office very recently put out a statement that said, protecting people must be the priority. I am warning organizations today that data protection law is not an excuse and it does not stop you sharing data that may assist with tackling fraud. Organizations acting responsibly can be reassured that we will take this into account if something goes wrong, and we need to consider a regulatory response. Obviously, that's one office, and that's a statement. It's not a regulation, but I think it really hopefully goes a long way towards addressing some of the concerns that I think are rightfully raised. And I think the kind of the core thing that can emerge out of this group and these conversations, again, kind of going back to what Steve and James said, is to the greater extent the rules of the road are set down in paper and everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. I think this really goes squarely towards this concept of really minimizing as much as is humanly possible the risk first that something would go wrong. And if it goes wrong, all of the proper process has been followed. This is done in good faith, and that would be taken into account by regulators.
Thank you, Brian. Nigel, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll do my best. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Steve. Thanks others for doing this second webinar on this important issue. Just a few points. First of all, on the data side, and I recognise this is absolute key in terms of what can be disclosed and what can't be disclosed, and etc. The approach given, or the approach outlined by Brazil, I think is very useful indeed. I mean, certainly the decision of ICANN some time ago to not differentiate between legal and non-legal persons, I think was understandable, perhaps at the time, but is something that certainly needs to be looked at again in light of GDPR practice and etc. I mean, there's some European countries that have found ways around this, including Denmark, and even the UK to an extent through Nominet. Secondly, where governments are coming from, I do not detect in the GAC a great desire to go gung-ho for regulation and control and everything like that. I think there is an understanding these are really complex issues, as we've seen with the urgent requests scenario. And what we've seen through that, I think, is the ability of sides to, not sides, but the ability of parts of the constituencies to diverge on this particular issue. And now the opportunity for the parts of the SOACs to come together in this dual track mechanism that we'll be going forward with. So I think there is every sort of expectation and hope there. On a couple of other things in relation to having a structure and an architecture, and again, I don't think governments are wedded to the absolute nature of such an architecture. I do think governments will expect some degree of uniformity. Law enforcement authorities, of course, others can talk for their needs and aspirations, but clearly they need to have one place to go, or at least some sort of structure to make requests into. The RDRS, well, I don't need to say much about it. I mean, some people have found it helpful. Some people have perhaps not found it helpful. I understand that the board are considering that it might need to carry on for, I wouldn't say become permanent, although I was told that was some language used, but certainly to go beyond the trial period. And if it could apply to all registrars, I think that would be a great way forward. I think it is strange when governments, when our ministers ask questions about the RDRS and say how it works, and we say, well, it's voluntary, really. It doesn't sum up the importance of it, really. And I'll stop there. Thank you for this work, and I really do hope it goes forward.
Thank you, Nigel. We just have a few more minutes, and I would love for Emanuele Iovini to intervene. And we may have to have a part 3 after this because time went fast.
I try to be as fast as possible. I work at Europol as the governance expert, and I work on all the governance matters, especially the internet governance. And we are really following closely the new regulations that are helping us maybe more than the other countries. They're helping the Europe because they are converging. And these are the e-evidence regulation, the NIS2 with the Article 28, and the second additional protocol of the Convention of Budapest on the Article 6 especially. These are giving a lot of power to the government actually, because all the service provider registrars are to comply to them and be able to answer to the answers of the law enforcement. Who enforces the law enforcement? Maybe we do it ourselves, but we have also to look at the fact that we are under judicial authorities. So we also have to always listen to them. And if someone chooses to comply with us, we have to also comply with the judicial authority. We, to help the service providers in our countries, we have a platform, which is the Sirius platform, which lets the provider check if the domain of the requester is legitimate. That could help us understand if the request comes from someone which is not maybe legitimate. But what instead helps from the other countries which are outside Europe is the second additional protocol. If it is transposed into the country's law, it will help us because there is always an article, which is Article 7, if I'm not wrong, which makes them create a notification authority. The notification authority can stop or let the request go on. So if some kind of provider has doubts about the legitimate request, it can check with the notification authority if it is legitimate or not. So these are a lot of tools that we are developing in Europe. The second additional protocol is even outside Europe, so will help us a lot. NIS2 also with Article 28 defines the legitimate users. So everyone transposing the NIS2 we'll have to define which legitimate users are, which are not only law enforcement, but even other kind of users like intellectual properties checkers and so on. So all these regulations converge to the same place, like the requester should be legitimate and the service provider, registry should have the information that the requester needs. So this takes time. Maybe we'll see the light in 1-2 years. I don't know when everyone will manage to transpose all these regulations, but I think we were in a good start in Europe actually for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Emanuele. And you were last but certainly not least. I know there's a lot of questions about the NIS2 transposition and the delays and what that might mean. And I do believe that that whole bucket of who's regulating the regulators and how the transposition will work is worthy of another discussion. So I'm going to put a pin in that and invite you back to whatever we do next. And in the interest of time, I'm going to close this out by reminding everybody that the Edgemoor team and the people you see on the screen today, many are part of that team. We have formal and informal discussion groups, but of course it's led by Steve Crocker. My husband, who's not on screen, Klaus Stoll, is assisting Steve with the operational functions of the Edgemoor Institute now. They will be in Seattle. They will have space for meetings. You can contact that at info at, Steve, why don't you give the correct email address or put it in the Q&A pod so I don't mess it up. But I do believe it's info at edgemoorinstitute.org, but I may be wrong. So I apologize for my not remembering it immediately offhand. Yeah, it's info at edgemoorresearch.org. And I'm going to put it in the Q&A chat pod so people have it there as well. And I want to thank everybody again. I want to thank Steve particularly for his tireless work and his dedication to convening all stakeholders, which has been, it's been a challenge, but we're trying. And Steve, we have about 10 seconds if you'd like to say a quick final word.
Well, the quick final word is thank you. We're going to continue various efforts. Been some discussion about having a kind of town hall format so that we can have much more interaction with people who are attending this, and more to come. And as Loria said, we'll be in Seattle. Look forward to as many interactions as people are interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we can take it away. Jim, did you want to say something or are you waving? Just waving. Okay.
Recording.